Today on Channeled, I am honored to welcome Dr. Eben Alexander. He is a former Harvard-trained neurosurgeon. He spent 25 years operating on the brain and teaching at institutions at Harvard. And in 2008, his life and his scientific worldview changed forever when a rare brain infection left him in a week-long coma. During that time, Eben experienced a profound near-death experience. It challenged everything he believed about consciousness, reality, and the nature of existence. Since then, he's become a global voice in conversations bridging neuroscience and spirituality. He's the author of multiple New York Times bestselling books, including The Proof of Heaven and Living in a Mindful Universe, among other things. Eben, I am so grateful to have you here.
Hi, everyone. I am Julie Edmonds, your host of Channeled, tapping into the wisdom of your soul.
Hello, Dr. Alexander. It's so glad to have you today.
Well, Julie, thanks so much for having me on. It's great to be with you.
Awesome. Well, let's just get started. So let's take us back. Let's take the viewers back to before the near-death experience. You were firmly rooted in a scientific worldview. Can you just take us back to that time and tell us a little bit about how did you view the world, and then what changed?
Well, important to point out that my adoptive father, and note I said adopted. Yes, that's a crucial part of my story, that I was adopted. He was a globally renowned neurosurgeon. He was a tremendous influence and mentor in my life. And I really wanted to emulate what he had done. And that's what kind of led me into medicine and neurosurgery. Now, important to point out, my dad was a combat surgeon in the Second World War. He served over 2 years in the Pacific Theater. He started in New Guinea, then up into the Philippines, where he earned a Bronze Star, and then on into Japan. But for him, his belief in God never conflicted with his scientific beliefs and his knowledge of neuroscience and the brain and the mind. For him, he was very comfortable with power of prayer, with this God that he used all the time in his healing work. Now, like many of us who grew up in the 60s and 70s, like I did, yes, I was certain that science is the pathway to truth, but I also made the same mistake many people make. And that mistake is thinking that Newtonian deterministic science is a pathway towards truth. That is not the case. The pathway towards truth is quantum physics, which opens up a tremendous set of possibilities for human interaction and human existence based on all these extraordinary events like near-death experiences, which we can discuss more in detail. But the reality is, I had thought that Newtonian determinism was a science that would lead me to truth. And quantum physics opens the door to the primacy of consciousness, the reality of a unified spiritual force at the core of the universe. All of it starts to make sense when you realize the depths of where quantum physics is trying to take us.
Wow, that was amazing introduction. So your worldview changed in 2008 when you entered into the coma. So let's just start there. What were the doctors expecting? How dire was your prognosis at that point?
Well, it was actually a very severe case of bacterial meningitis. And that's why some of my biggest support over the last 17 years since I had this experience has been from the scientific community. Because once they studied my medical records and started paying attention to the details of my case, they realized, just as I did in the first weeks and months after awakening from coma, that our modern kind of conceptions of brain, mind, and consciousness fall apart when exposed to the greater realities of this kind of experience. And there are millions of these experiences out there. And they're all basically trying to send us in the same direction. So at the beginning of that week, though, when I was first taken to the emergency room, now I was in coma from home. There's a myth out there in the lay press that my coma was medication induced. Well, no, I went deep into coma in my own home without any medication at all. In fact, in his book After, Dr. Bruce Grayson, who's a skeptical psychiatrist who has studied near-death experiences for more than 45 years, his whole chapter 10 in that book after is devoted to my case. And he makes it very clear that I went into coma before any sedation. And when I came out of coma, I was still on very heavy sedation. So the important point of my coma are the details of what meningitis does to the brain, not a sedation effect from medications. And in fact, Dr. Grayson was part of a team of 3 doctors who wrote a case report on my medical records. That came out in September 2018 in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases. And that case report makes it very clear my brain was in no shape to harbor any dream or hallucination. When you read it, you realize about the extensive nature of this meningitis. It involved all lobes of my brain. No part was left unscathed. There really was no place for a dream or hallucination to happen, much less the most profound kind of spiritual, detailed, transformational experience of my entire life that had to happen between days 1 and 4 or 1 and 5 of my 7-day coma. We explain all that timing, especially in the books Proof of Heaven and also in the book Living in a Mindful Universe. But that's really the mystery. And of course, the deeper mystery for anybody who's paying attention to my case is, how did I have this complete recovery? That was the part that stunned the peer-reviewed scientific editors of the scientific journal. They challenged the 3 authors of the case report. How do you explain his unprecedented, apparently miraculous recovery from a weakened coma due to severe bacterial meningoencephalitis involving all lobes of his brain? And they said it's because he had a near-death experience. In other words, the scientific explanation for my extraordinary recovery is that I had this rich spiritual experience that allowed me to basically manifest the free will of my higher soul and engineer a recovery and come back to this world.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
I cannot claim from any ego perspective to have played a role in it, but I've been open-minded my whole life to learning and kind of observing and having my beliefs challenged. And I think for that reason, I was allowed to do this very deep dive and then come back to share it. There's really no way to explain it except when you include this profound near-death experience. And of course, anyone who's read the book Proof of Heaven realize that the thing that really shocked me into understanding about that was when I received a picture in the mail 4 months after my coma of a birth sister who I'd never known because she'd passed in 1998, 2 years before I even found out about her existence. And yet she's right at the heart of my discovering this profound mystery, because it was a picture of that birth sister 4 months after my coma that enlightened me to, oh my God, there is the guardian angel, the spiritual guide, who had been so mysterious to me because she'd been such a critical part of my near-death experience. And yet I came back to this world shocked that I didn't know who she was. And then I started reading the NDE literature and realized, oh my gosh, that kind of spiritual guide is always a central figure in your life. And yet I knew her very well from the experience, and yet I didn't know who she was in my earthly life. And that was, that's
so you
where...
knew her, I'm sorry, you knew her in your spiritual existence, but you didn't know her in your waking
I'd never met her in this material body life. No. And that's where it was such a shocker, because in the picture, it's almost like she's looking at me as if to say, do you finally get it? The picture was taken 3 weeks before she passed from this world out in California. And anyway, it was just a tremendous mind bender to me to connect all those dots and make that recognition, because that part of the journey was so real, so crisp and alive, and yet it was so difficult to explain from my conventional materialistic neuroscientific ideas about how things work. There was no way to explain it, actually. So to have that deep mystery buried in the middle of my NDE that was such a focal point of the entire journey, and then ends up being the great revelation that shows me a connection to the real world in my real life, that's what got my attention. And so the rest of it has just been incredible kind of gravy and icing on the cake, coming to this deeper understanding. And then also realizing that the entire scientific community is being driven in this direction because of this evidence. And it causes us to really question the very basic assumptions of our scientific knowledge. There's a beautiful quote from Heisenberg, Werner Heisenberg, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics for his work on the uncertainty principle in quantum mechanics. And he says the first gulp from the glass of natural sciences will lead you towards atheism. But at the bottom of the glass, God is waiting for you. He knew exactly what the implications were for quantum physics in the deeper sense of primacy of consciousness. And when you bring in all the other evidence, which we do in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, evidence from the hard problem of consciousness and neuroscience, from the binding problem, the apparent unity of consciousness and philosophy of mind, and then move into all the evidence for non-local consciousness out of parapsychology, like all the Gansfeld experiments that show telepathy beyond any doubt. And then also Guillaume Playfair's book on twin telepathy, where he talks about 35% of identical twins having powerful telepathic experiences. And you start realizing, especially when you bundle in quantum physics and its very strong advice that consciousness is fundamental in the universe, all this starts to make sense. And that's where we go in Living in a Mindful Universe, and certainly where I go on my website, ebenalexander.com. So people who want to learn more can go there. And in particular, there's a 33-day journey on the welcome page at ebenalexander.com. And that's an email drip campaign that will introduce you each day for 33 days to a major concept out of that book, Living in a Mindful Universe.
Oh, that's fascinating. And we'll definitely put all of this in the show notes as well. So let's go back to during the coma. Okay. So I'm sure the listeners are going to want to hear about this. And those maybe who haven't read the book yet, but probably will now after this, you've described it as entering a different realm. It's like a totally different realm. What was the very first thing that you became aware of? Like what happened?
Well, it's important to point out that one of the key ingredients of my NDE, and I've never heard of this being a severe in anybody else's case. And NDEs are always for the soul who's having them. So I guess as a neuroscientist fascinated by consciousness, I needed this especially deep dive, but it was amnesia. I had no memory of Earth, of humanity, of this universe, of any of the events of Eben Alexander's life. My language was completely gone. In many ways, it was an empty slate, a tabula rasa. And I think that empty slate was necessary for me to take this particularly deep dive and then to come back with the lessons that I was to gain from the journey. So in that setting of amnesia, it all started in what I call the earthworm's eye view, a very primitive, coarse, kind of unresponsive realm. And it was like being in dirty jello, deep underground, kind of murky depths. It sounds foreboding and kind of hellish when I talk about it. And yet when it was occurring, it was the only thing I knew. I had no memory of anything else. So I just assumed, okay, this is the way it is. I was perfectly fine with it. The good news is it didn't last forever. I was rescued by a slowly spinning kind of pure white light with fine golden and silvery tendrils around it. And it came slowly spinning with this perfect musical melody. And as it did, it opened up like a rip in the fabric of that ugly earthworm eye view and led up into this brilliant, ultra real Gateway Valley. And that was a world where many Earth-like features, but in many ways, a world of perfection, kind of like Plato's world of ideals for the individual soul. And in that Gateway Valley, I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. I never had any body awareness at all during the entire experience. But I was witnessing things, and I was one of millions of other butterflies. So it was absolutely visually powerful, stimulating, beautiful situation here with all these butterflies above this meadow. And down in the meadow, there were thousands of beings dancing, lots of joy and merriment. Remember children playing and dogs jumping, incredible festivities. And all of that was being fueled because up above were these swooping orbs of angelic choirs that were emanating chants, anthems, hymns that would just thunder through my awareness. Incredible awe and majesty. And as much as this may sound foreign to some people, to many people who read the book Proof of Heaven, it reminded them of something in their own life that they'd forgotten. And it reminded them so much that many of them reached out to contact me. And that is the subject matter of much of the second book, Map of Heaven. It's just other people having these experiences too. In fact, you find your neighbors have them. These experiences are all over the place. So it's not just the scientific community finally saying, well, these things are allowable within everything we know about science in this universe. But also realizing the universe is a much grander place than all that, and that the universe seems to care a lot about how we behave and act as human beings, how we treat each other. And that's where the life review is such an absolutely critical part of this understanding. The life review is something that is reported and about half of NDEs. And really, because of my amnesia, I couldn't have an Eben Alexander life review, but I did see life reviews and reincarnation in very powerful fashion during my journey and some visions I had. So at any rate, in this.
Okay, sorry. Tell us more about that. So you had no awareness of a body. It was more of an observation with almost a depiction of heaven in my mind, with these angelic beings and butterflies and children laughing. And what happened next?
Well, it turns out that is when I was aware of this summer breeze that blew through, as I call it. It's like a divine wind or the breath of God. And that was my first awareness in that amnesic state of the reality and the very sourcing of my conscious awareness and that infinitely loving creative God force at the core of the universe. That's something that NDEers encounter no matter what their prior beliefs, religions, etc. Many atheists and agnostics have, in a near-death experience, encountered that same loving kind of God presence, but it's not owned by any religion. That's very important. It's not a discussion of whether you're talking about God or Allah, Brahman, Vishnu, Jehovah, Yahweh, Great Spirit, Tao, all the many words humans have used for that benevolent wisdom that we sense on these deep dives, like in a near-death experience. It's something grander than that, but it has everything to do with love, compassion, kindness, mercy, acceptance. This is a very loving force. It's not a judgmental force. And as I said, this realm, this was for me only a gateway, because I was still destined to higher and higher ascents in the spiritual journey. But in this Gateway Valley, that's where I also saw this beautiful girl beside me on the butterfly wing.
Wow.
And I remember she looked
beside you
on the butterfly wing, and she, initially, I just remember these sparkling blue eyes, high forehead, high cheekbones, broad smile, soft brown hair framing her lovely face. And she looked at me with this look of pure love. And yet what came with it was a mental connection. It was a telepathic, a kind of emotional mind meld between our minds. And that's where she reassured me. And that reassurance came in a nonverbal form. But when I translated it into words weeks later, when I was recording all this, her message to me is, you are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You're richly cared for. You can do no wrong. Now, I wish I'd explained that last piece a little more fully in the book Proof of Heaven, because some people don't realize that at that point in the journey, and with all this light and love and beauty and God love everywhere around me, that's where we go through our life review. And I did witness that kind of thing, as I said, as I ascended further. And yet in that brilliant light and love and perfection, anything we've done wrong, greedy, selfish, giving out pain and suffering to others, looks especially bad in that life review. So when I say you can do no wrong, remember that's in the setting, that infinite God force and your soul group witnessing the events of your life. And that's where I'd like to diverge a little bit and just share what Bruce Grayson, this skeptical psychiatrist who studied NDEs for more than 45 years, says about life reviews, because they're very instructive about the nature of reality. And in an article in the Journal of Near-Death Studies back in fall of 2021, he discussed almost 700 life reviews. They occur in about half of his database of near-death experiences. And interestingly, he said that 37%, about a third of those people, describe their entire life being involved. And you might say, well, wait a minute, how does a whole life get involved in a 10-minute cardiac arrest? And the answer is, in that realm, you're truly in an eternal realm, which is very different from our sense of time flow in the material realm. And in that realm, you can relive your entire life. And it doesn't have to be sped up or anything. It's just, a third of these people said their entire life was part of that life review. Now, almost half of them, 47%, said it was a reliving, not just a remembering of events, as if the events were still ongoing. That is very important. In other words, the universe pays enough attention to what we're doing and thinking, and to kind of our soul journey through this God force, that it enables us to re-witness and relive those events with an opportunity to change the situation and show more love, kindness, compassion, and mercy. Now, moving through the rest of the statistics, he says that 3/4 of these life reviews stress that the life review was from the perspective of everyone involved.
Oh,
now,
wow.
that is absolutely mind-bending. 3/4 of these life reviews involve the perspective of everyone. So in other words, if you've been handing out pain and suffering to others in your life review, you get on the receiving end of that. If you've been a narcissist or a sociopath and you've been hurting other people left and right through your whole life, in your life review, you re-experience that from their perspective. So the life review, in many ways, is the golden rule: treat others as you would like to be treated, written into the very fabric of the universe. So it's really an important kind of scientific observation of the nature of reality, that the universe pays that kind of attention and allows us to have that kind of review of our life events. And the final fact, the most common in his study, 84% of those life reviews were more real than lived experience memories. So you just got to realize that our life and our events and our thoughts and our actions play a much bigger role than we might think. And this
I don't understand. I don't understand the last part. Can you explain that a little bit more? Is that not how we observed it, but what actually happened? Is that what you're saying?
Well, they just say that, and this is what I experienced. The thing that to me was so shocking was that kind of ultra reality. The fact that, this world, people often make the mistake of thinking that a near-death experience is kind of vague and dreamy, murky, dreamlike. But no, this is vague and murky and dreamlike. This material world and these material bodies is the kind of dreamy thing. And when we're in that mode, in that spiritual realm, it's sharp, crisp, alive, real, powerful, solid, absolute reality. I mean, it's just a stunning difference between that and this. And so that's the point that 84% of people who report these life reviews say is a quality of the life review, is that there's a more kind of realistic aspect to the living. It's more detailed and transformational. Although I always stress in my talks, never forget that this world, the material world, is where we actually get the soul growth done. So even though we're temporarily dumbed down and don't have the wisdom of our higher soul, and I believe that's all for a purpose, we're meant to have skin in the game here, which means that our ego mind in many ways is kind of running the show for a lot of us. But a huge part of this whole discussion is coming to recognize that we have that little ego mind, and that's involved with the program of running the body in the material world. But there's a much more important aspect of us, a more eternal aspect, that I call higher soul. And that's the part that's interconnected with all of our fellow soul groups, higher souls. And in fact, with that God soul, that cosmic soul of the universe, cosmic mind at the core of it all, that's the very source of our awareness. That's what I saw in my journey. So this is a complete flip from that old view of looking at our ego and the linguistic part of the brain as being what's determining choices we make and things that we do, and realizing that there's a part of us that's far grander than that. And that's that higher soul part. That's the part that connects with the universe at large, with that God mind, with all of our fellow beings. I mean, this is a very interconnecting activity, is this deep dive into consciousness. And we find that we're all interconnected. And that's why the life reviews are so important. If you hurt another, you're hurting yourself. The more we can adopt the kind of this higher notion of kind of soul groups and that God mind is the source of conscious awareness, and the fact that we're here to kind of learn and transform and become the highest form of the soul we came here to be, that's when we can start paying attention to meditation, centering prayer, going within. Because once you realize that your mental phenomenal space in your mind is not simply generated by a 3.5-pound gelatinous mass floating in a warm, dark bath between your ears, but is part of cosmic consciousness of the mind of the universe, it becomes much more useful to do meditation, centering prayer, and going within, and all of that. And yet, the actions we take in this world are what determine our soul growth. And that's why that life review is important, but hopefully our life is not been spent wasting it on the bleak and paltry fiction of materialism and pretending that, ego is the only thing that exists and the game is to get as many toys as you can before you die because that's the end of oblivion to your existence. And none of that is true. It's all about the higher good and helping others and showing love and compassion and kindness. Those are the rules that govern the world we learn about when we leave this world. And I'll point out that more than 90% of near-death experiencers, no matter what their prior belief system, but more than 90% of them come back not just believing in, but knowing in the reality of this God force at the core of the universe that unites us all, loves us all, is co-creative with our emergent realities, but that we're all part of that and we're in this together. So we're really here to help each other. And that's a tremendous lesson that differs from much of what the polarized, political, and conflicted warring world of today actually does. So this is all about making the world a better place.
Great. I have so many questions. So just one quick question. When you were experiencing this realm, did you have all of your senses? I mean, I know you said you weren't aware of a body, but could you feel? You said you could hear and see. Could you smell? Could you taste? Or were there more senses that we don't know about? In many ways, yeah, your senses are enhanced. In the book Proof of Heaven, I mentioned the concept of synesthesia, where people, for example, can hear colors or they can see sounds, things like that. There's this overlap. And you run into that in extreme forms in these NDEs because a lot of it is what I call knowledge through identification, where you actually become huge swathes of the scene in your awareness. And that's how you learn the knowledge of it. And that's how you see the interconnections. And it's one of the reasons why NDEs are often described as ineffable or beyond our language, is because when you're in that eternal space where birth, death, everything in between, events of past life, potentials for future lives, all of these things are simultaneously presented to you, it all makes far more sense. And you see these connections that even when you come back to this world and trying to explain it to others seem very difficult to put into words and explain. And yet when you're in that space of meditation and centering prayer, it seems so clear. This is why we encourage people to meditate. This is why a central message of our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, is not only this is the new scientific reality, but here are some tools for how you can meditate. And specifically, what I use and have used daily for the last 13 years or so is binaural beat brainwave entrainment. Sacredacoustics.com is where people can learn a lot more. I've spent a few hours this morning meditating. It's a form of differential frequency brainwave entrainment. And the reason that's important is there was a phenomenon discovered back in the 1800s by Wilhelm Heinrich Dove, a Prussian physicist and meteorologist, where a simple pure tone to one ear, say 100 hertz, 100 cycles per second, and then a slightly different one to the other, 104 hertz, for example. 104, 100 hertz would give you a 4 hertz signal. That's the arithmetic difference between the two inputs. And that's generated way down in the lower brainstem. This is all something that's been known for 200 years. And yet it was only in the late 20th century that people started using that effect of binaural beats and that wavering sensation in the brain to get into extended states of conscious awareness. And specifically, Robert Monroe used binaural beats and what he called hemisync to drive out-of-body experiences and to experiment with that. And he ran a lot of courses on that material. And then also the Stanford Research International and other groups interested in remote viewing found that remote viewing skills, which is a way of gleaning information across space and time and beyond the ken of our physical senses. And remote viewing is something that can be greatly enhanced through binaural beats. So that's why I was attracted to it all back in 2010, 2 years after my coma. I'd read 150 books over 2 years and trying to get answers from quantum physics, mystical traditions, East and West, and finally realized I've got to explore my own consciousness if I have a hope of ever unraveling this deep mystery. So I started meditating on a regular basis using sacred acoustics, and I can tell you it's an incredible experience, a great gift. Give yourself some time with it. And I'll point out there's also clinical evidence supporting binaural beats and specifically sacred acoustics in a clinical setting to alleviate anxiety.
That was a study published by Dr. Anna Yusim, Y-U-S-I-M. She's a busy psychiatrist in New York City, Yale trained, and she wrote a beautiful pilot study reporting a 26% reduction in anxiety symptoms over 2 weeks of listening to sacred acoustics. That's versus only a 7% reduction in the control group that got standard talk psychotherapy for anxiety over 2 weeks. So just by listening to tones, you have about a threefold improvement in people's ability to deal with anxiety. And I promise you, there's much more going on here. And if you read the original article that Dr. Yusim wrote, and that came out, I think it was February of 2020. So it was right at the beginning of the pandemic. She found such a benefit. And her subject material from Sacred Acoustics was a set of files called the Whole Mind Bundle. And so, in fact, when Karen Newell, my wife and the co-author of Living in Mindful Universe, found this beautiful beneficial effect, and it was right at the beginning of the pandemic, she made that Whole Mind Bundle available at a deep discount, $19, I think, for the whole thing. And yet she also realized because of the pandemic and economic collapse, a lot of people wouldn't have any money at all. So she put a free button on sacredacoustics.com so people could download that same set of powerful audio files, the Whole Mind Bundle, that Dr. Anna Yusim found to be so beneficial for relieving anxiety. And now people could go to sacredacoustics.com and they could easily access that Whole Mind Bundle. And if they had no financial reserves because of the stress of the pandemic and economic collapse, they had a free button. That free button is still there. So we hope that people who have the financial reserves will pay for the product, but we wanted to make sure it was accessible to everybody without any financial limitations. And that's why Karen Newell, out of the grace and goodness of her heart, decided to leave it available to the general public, to help in our current world, which is greatly challenged with polarization and anxiety.
Yeah, I know. And I'm very familiar with binaural beats. I'm certified in hypnotherapy. And so, we use a lot of that to get into that trance-like state as well and access the subconscious mind. I have a question. You mentioned Robert Monroe, and he talks a lot about astral projection. I'm very familiar with that. I've experienced that a lot in my life, actually. How is your astral projection? How is your near-death experience different than an astral projection experience?
Well, I would say that the one thing I've used meditation, sacred acoustics, many a time to return to the realms that I first discovered in my NDE, and not just to recover memories of the events of my NDE, but to develop powerful relationships and understanding and guidance with the various entities and with that God force that are there. But the one thing I've never fully duplicated with my meditative efforts is that full-bore sense of ultra reality, everything happening at once, but it doesn't matter because it's all flowing through me as this gigantic information field, that incredible ultra reality that was such a hallmark of my near-death experience and that I know occurs in so many other NDEers that I've talked with or read about or studied. And I have not yet duplicated that with the meditative efforts. So it could just be I have to wait till the next time my brain is that completely divested of this earthly existence and my soul is ready to make the transition. Maybe that's what I have to wait for. But, and I keep trying. So, and I can also tell you that I know that my NDE gave me a touchstone that's been very beneficial at my, more recent forays into that spiritual space. But I also know from the workshops that Karen and I have done, and we've done hundreds of workshops around the world, and I know from our results with those that other people who have never had an NDE can have the same kind of spiritual awakening. They can encounter souls of departed loved ones, come into a rich sense of connection with spiritual guides. I mean, there are many, many benefits that can accrue from using binaural beats on a regular basis. I encourage people to meditate. And the other thing I would suggest,
daily when you meditate, is it a daily practice and for how long? And
it's usually an hour or two. It's usually in the late morning, but sometimes I'll do it at very different times. Occasionally, I do it in the middle of the night or something if I want to. It also has affected my dream space. In other words, my dream space, what my body and mind and spirit used to use dream space for, is now very much part of the process of what I do in meditation. So I've found that my dream space is a lot more kind of relaxed and easygoing because a lot of the work I get done in these meditative experiences using sacred acoustics as a driver for deep transcendental exposure.
So would you call this sort of a growth or a healing process when you do this, where you're tapping into these realms, or just giving you perspective, or it's just slowing your brain waves down, or what's it doing?
It's all about healing. It's all about becoming more of the souls we came here to be. And this is why I know that quote from Socrates. He said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Well, we know from life reviews that the universe has a mechanism by which our lives can be very seriously examined. And when you develop a rich interest in meditation and centering prayer, of going within, connecting with that mind of the universe, with that infinitely loving God force, and all in an effort to come closer to the soul you came here to be, to learn and grow and teach and help other souls. We're all in this process of learning and teaching together. And I think that's ultimately what this is all about. We're learning more about ourselves, about our reasons for being. And so I would say that the whole reason for existence is inscribed at the entrance to the temple of Apollo at Delphi in Greece. Know thyself. And that's exactly what all of us are here doing, is getting a much richer knowing of self. And of course, the first step is to step beyond the simplistic little ego mind. That's what a lot of us live with, is a little ego mind. And it's simply a program to run and kind of preserve this body. But it's not your ally in this kind of deep spiritual dive, or trying to come to a understanding of the reason for existence. We have to go a lot deeper than the ego allows us for that. But it also is a great vacation from the ego, because people who are slave to the ego, like narcissists and sociopaths, they do not have a happy life. And the further we can get away from that egomaniacal behavior, the more we come into alignment with the souls we came here to be. So in many ways, this whole journey is one of patting the ego on the back and putting it in time out, but coming to recognize that we're much richer, more capable beings than that, and that we, in fact, are sharing the mind of the universe. So this is all about a process of mutual growth, teaching, learning, understanding, and coming into a richer awareness about all the facets of our existence.
Do you think that since this experience, has your intuition or your knowing or just any kind of extrasensory perception increased? And if we're talking to someone in just layman's terms who's never experienced near-death experience or, astral projection, but they do meditate, what would you have to say? What advice do you have for that?
Well, I think what I've recognized is just a much keener sense of kind of intuition and connection.
Yeah.
A lot of what I have come to realize is that each and every soul is doing the best they can with what they have in that moment. Right. And so the more I can kind of help them to get to a point where they can kind of lift themselves up by their own bootstraps and really have the power to grow into this, and that is by connecting with your sense of higher soul through meditation and centering prayer, then that's all, a benefit for all of us. We're all here to help each other, and the more I can help others get on that same pathway of self-understanding and kind of harmony with the universe at large, the better. And so for me, this is all, a tremendous gift. And I can tell you that the gift the world has given back to me has been stories by the thousands that other experiencers have shared with me, emails, communications, letters, lots and lots of ways people communicate it. But the good news is, by opening myself to the world in many ways has opened itself to me. And that sharing has allowed me to come into a much richer understanding of the many, many myriad facets of this kind of awakening and interchange, and how the spiritual world is impinging on us in many, many ways to help us with this journey of understanding. And to me, that's been one of the greatest gifts, is just by acknowledging that when I've gone out to the world and shared my own experience, and I've been giving it away as much as I can, through all these interviews. I've done hundreds and hundreds of podcasts, YouTube videos, et cetera, tried to get it out there for everybody. This is not about, money. Some people sometimes accuse you of, trying to achieve wealth through selling books. Well, no. In fact, I was probably more shocked than anybody that Proof of Heaven hit #1 on the New York Times bestseller list the first week it came out.
Congratulations.
And it was there for 42 weeks on the #1 spot.
Wow.
It's been more than 2 years on the New York Times nonfiction bestseller list. Now, I'm not saying that to brag about the book. What I'm doing is pointing out that it resonated with millions and millions of people who had had similar experiences. And this includes Proof of Heaven being translated into more than 40 languages around the world. So it resonated with a gigantic portion of humanity. And this is what I've been busy doing, is trying to share that message out as widely and possibly and freely as I can. I don't want any impediments to people hearing this story. And so for me, it's kind of a win-win situation. Give it all out, share these stories. The world shares them back with me. The scientific community has provided the biggest support of any group of all. So for people who think this is either science or spirituality, I can tell you, no, they're both stronger together. And this is all about a scientific movement that has very rich kind of roots in that spiritual realm and in our spiritual understanding. You cannot deny that aspect of our existence. And a huge part of the discussion we haven't even gotten into yet concerns another part of what I saw in my visions, and that is reincarnation. Before my coma, I had no idea that there was a big body of scientific evidence by multiple investigators that fully supported the reality of reincarnation. In my NDE, I saw reincarnation as an absolute necessity. There was no way to think we would only get one incarnation in a physical body. That was nonsensical with my new knowledge. And so come back to this world and very quickly discovered that one of the greatest centers on earth for studying these phenomena, especially reincarnation, past life memories in children, indicating reincarnation, that center was 60 miles north of me at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. Wow. In fact, I've moved closer, so I'm now right outside of Charlottesville. So this is all about the science of understanding. Science is a very powerful tool, and science is what leads the way towards this spiritual revolution that's happening in the world today.
Dr. Eben, where was your proof of reincarnation in this experience that you had?
In the experience, it came in 2 visions I had in passing, especially going from the Gateway Valley into the core realm through that light portal. That portal was offered up by the angelic choirs. So all these portals connecting the spiritual realms involve music, or what I remembered as music. But I hope the listeners all realize by now that music experienced in that realm is the perfect ideal form and has nothing to do with the limitations of 4-dimensional space-time and the physics of music in this realm. It's a much richer, deeper kind of exposure. And in those 2 visions, one was the flying fish vision. I won't spend too much time on it because more important was the big vision that happened on a later passage through the core. Because in my NDE, I cycled through these multiple layers many times. That's how I was able to learn so much from the experience. But the other vision was, I call the Indra's Net vision. And that was this incredible sense of interwoven threads. And the weave of the thread actually was our birth, living this life, death, rebirth. So that cycle was the weave of what I saw in this beautiful fabric that was being woven towards this golden center of kind of achievement and goal. And that was what Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who wrote a beautiful book in the mid-20th century called The Phenomenon of Man, where he stressed that evolution was happening, but on a much bigger scale than just biological evolution on Earth in a Darwinian sense, all of consciousness evolving. And that's exactly what I saw in this vision. Wow. This Indra's net, these golden threads, all of us contributing through this process of reincarnation towards the growth, knowledge, understanding, learning, and teaching of that cosmic mind. We're all contributing to that. We often use the analogy that mind, the God mind, is like this giant diamond. And each of us, a sentient being, is a facet on this diamond. And of course, the facets are always changing. And they're always changing kind of the essence of how this diamond appears. But ultimately, it's all improving. The whole thing is evolving towards this Christ awareness, which is not a Christianity form of Christ, but more of the Jesus of Nazareth, the original kind of unpolluted version of Christ, which is just pure love, compassion, kindness, mercy, acceptance.
I love
So
this.
at any rate, that was the vision I had. And it made it clear to me that one physical lifetime was not enough and that we had to have souls that came back over multiple lifetimes contributing towards this soul growth. And all of us are part of that oversoul, of that God mind that is actually doing the growing.
Wow. Fascinating. I have two more quick questions. So how did it end? Was there like a certain, sounds like you're going into these certain levels. Was there an ending of it all? Do you remember coming back? And then lastly, your miraculous recovery and how you healed yourself. Those two. Hit on those.
Okay. Well, in terms of the your first question on just
your experience and your travel, you're traveling to these realms.
Yeah. The interesting thing is that all of that, I cycled through these realms multiple times, as I mentioned. And I was always told every time I entered the core, which was the highest level I went to, a complete oneness, resolution of all dualities. In our world, we have masculine, feminine, dark, light, good, evil. In that core realm, everything was united. And that's where I recognized that my very conscious awareness was directly sourced in that God mind at the core of all of existence. And that is a unifying ingredient to all of us. And yet we have individual free will. That is a crucial part of this. And so that was kind of the big vision I had, was this wonderful sense of kind of acceptance, of growing together, of kind of cooperative love of the Creator for the creation that we all share as we grow in this kind of knowledge and understanding. So it was a beautiful sense of kind of oneness and how we can contribute to each other's well-being. And this life review concept was very important, but so was reincarnation. And then to discover that, for example, at University of Virginia in the last 6.5 decades, they've studied more than 2,500 cases of past life memories in children suggesting reincarnation, of which 1,700 they've solved. That is 1,700 cases plus where they found the person described by the child who actually lived before. And many of these cases were from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, so before the internet. And today they're very careful, to avoid being kind of fooled or fraud or what have you. And most people aren't trying to defraud the world on this. In fact, what the investigators find is that sometimes the families are fooling themselves. But in most of these cases, you don't find that at all. You find that the child is simply telling a story of someone who was born before, died. Usually 70% of those cases at UVA had a violent, sudden kind of early death. So yes, it's important to point out that these were not just end of life, somebody lived 90 years and died of old age in their bed, but generally more of the people who died suddenly, unexpectedly. Those are the ones that give us the most obvious cases of reincarnation, where the memories are that sharp. And in fact, we know it's a reliving of events and not just a remembering of somebody else's life, because these children come in with phobias, nightmares, behaviors that mean they lived it. They weren't just kind of gently exposed to those facts. And anyway, so that reincarnation literature is a giant part demanding that we have a bigger model of brain, mind, and consciousness. And it's one that does not include memories being stored in the brain. That's something we discuss in Living in a Mindful Universe, that memories are not stored in the brain. It's something that neurosurgeons have suspected for a long time. There's never been a case where a brain resection led to documented removal of long-term memories. So that is a myth. And in fact, Wilder Penfield discouraged that myth even in his book 1975, The Mystery of the Mind. Is a neurosurgeon who did many awake craniotomies, stimulating the brain in awake patients. He knew better than just about anybody the brain does not fully explain the workings of the mind. And he made that clear.
So memories are not stored in the mind, is what you're saying.
They're not stored in the brain.
Oh, in the brain.
They're not stored in the physical brain. Okay, that's the important thing. So the brain is a filter. It allows us access to memory. It allows access to consciousness, but it's not the ultimate producer of either.
Wow. Okay, so let's finish on, you had this miraculous recovery. Tell me more.
Well, what happened there is as much a mystery to me as to anybody when it was happening. My doctors, I tried to tell them early on, like within a day or two of waking up from my coma, about my experience. And they would pat me on the back and say, well, your brain was soaking in pus. In fact, we have no idea how you're even coming back to us, but you can forget about it because the dying brain plays all kinds of tricks. So that was my first message from my doctors. And remember, it took about 2 months for all my neurosurgical and physics knowledge to come back to me. So early on, I had very little of that. In fact, I didn't even know the medical details of my case yet. But I was going to the hospital every few weeks, going to the doctors, going through medical records, looking at MRI, CT scans, trying to make sense of it. And it didn't line up. That was the problem. That's what challenged me initially, was all that damage to my brain, as Bruce Grayson and the authors in my case report made clear. There was no way for my brain to have a dream or hallucination. So where did all that come from? And that's what I needed an answer to. And that's what these 17 years of inquiry have led me to, with a tremendous amount of support from the scientific community. In fact, I would say that some of the result of all this is at bigelowinstitute.org. If you want indisputable scientific proof for the reality of the afterlife, go to bigelowinstitute.org. You'll find 29 essays that were written in 2021, all in a contest of proving the reality of the afterlife. They come at it from many different directions, and I highly recommend people go and start reading. But you'll find that about half those papers talk about near-death experiences, and about half of those papers talk about my near-death experience. So it's certainly featured prominently in that literature, but there are many other lines of inquiry that lead to this conclusion that the afterlife is real and scientifically validated. But if you start reading those essays, you'll quickly realize that this is, from the scientific viewpoint, we know that the afterlife is real. We just have to understand much more about how it all works. And I'll also point out, in terms of the reincarnation, there's a key ingredient here. It's called, I call it program forgetting. And it's something that Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker, the two MDs who've done most of that work at UVA concerning reincarnation, will tell you have to harvest these memories before age 5 or 6, because after that, there are processes in all of us that cover over those memories, so they disappear. So by the time we're 7 or 8 years old, we don't remember past lives in between lives. And that's why most of us say, no, there's no such thing as reincarnation. But that's because we forgot it. And that forgetting is intentional. And it has something to do with the current state of humanity, civilization, our knowledge about brain, mind, consciousness, the nature of the universe, and our abilities to move forward from this point with what we're learning.
This has been a complete honor and a pleasure and fascinating and a million other words. So it was
great,
for
Julie.
time. It's been amazing to have you. I know you've mentioned it before, but where can our listeners find you? And we'll put it all in the show notes as well.
Well, Eben, EbenAlexander.com is the best resource. On the welcome page there, you'll find a 33-day journey into the heart of consciousness. Click on that 33-day journey, leave your first name and email address. You'll be off and running 33 days of emails every day concerning major topics of living in a mindful universe, of our third book. And in addition to that, there's a community of more than 15,000 people who have taken that course over the last 7 years or so, 8 years, and they leave comments and they help each other. So every page of that 33 days is a page of community forming up of people sharing their own stories and insights. So that's a big resource. Also, I would recommend the recommended reading list. There's a lot of interviews on EbenAlexander.com. A lot of resources there. The FAQ page, very important for answering questions the public may have about me. Also, sacredacoustics.com, as we mentioned, a beautiful resource for meditation. There's a lot of information there to help people meditate. That whole mind bundle that we discussed is available at sacredacoustics.com. And InnerSanctumCenter.com, another resource. This is something Karen and I put together. It's Karen's wisdom, but it contains several ingredients. One is more than 50 interviews we did during the COVID pandemic with thought leaders around the world on consciousness. Those are all available for free at InnerSanctumCenter.com. Likewise, a series of sessions we've had with monthly sessions with fans of ours. And also there's a mental health practitioner course that we did with Dr. Anna Yusum that is available on that site. That does have a cost for professionals. Anyway, there's a lot of information at all these sites, InnerSanctumCenter.com, SacredAcoustics.com, EbenAlexander.com, and of course the books, Proof of Heaven, Map of Heaven and Living in a Mindful Universe. These are great
Amazing.
resources for people who want to get up to speed on this new science of consciousness and the nature of reality.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alexander. It has been an absolute pleasure. We'll make sure we add all of those into the show notes. And anybody listening that loves this, share this, subscribe, and we'll see you back for more. Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot, Julie. Great talking with you.
You too.